This summer, after the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent social uprisings for the fight for Black lives, I knew that something had to be done differently this academic year. My initiative was that of the first year read. This year's selection was that of Dr. Tatum's Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race. Our first year students will no doubt be exposed to endless books and articles, websites, and other readings during their tenure here at Wells. But isn't it fantastic that the very first piece of literature that was placed in each of their hands was this book, or more specifically, the 20th anniversary edition from 2017. My colleagues and I aim to set a precedent for what the heartbeat of our college actually is, which is inclusivity. There's no better way to move toward inclusion than to speak about race and racism with our community members. The question of how these complex and often difficult topics inform our everyday lives, and how to spark meaningful conversation to navigate solutions. This was the purpose behind this initiative. So throughout the semester, I held virtual spaces for weekly conversations to occur, and at the end of which I asked students to submit an essay of reflection. I'm happy to report that our finalist is here with us right now, Serena Sheridan, class of 2024. Serena, could you say a few words about yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Serina Sheridan. I'm a first year at Wells College. I'm currently majoring in mathematics and hoping to double major in computer science. I chose to delve into this first year read, not really knowing what was going to happen. I really want to just gain some knowledge about race and racism, as it's not really a topic that was really talked about throughout my life and my previous education as well. And I got a lot out of it. I got great conversations with some great students. I got to meet new people and got to really talk about the touchy subject of race and racism.
Thank you so much for being here, Serena, and really thank you for your unwavering commitment and contributions to the first year read. You were just such a pleasure to have. Thank you. So before we introduce our esteemed guests, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors. This moment would not be possible without the folks from the Anne Frank Tree Project, Cornell Cooperative Extension, Nazareth College's Social Work Department, Lansing Central Schools, Peachtown Elementary School, Tompkins Families, Tompkins Trust Company, and our supporter, On Point for College. Thank you to all our sponsors and supporters. Now for the moment we have all come here for. Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, President Emerita of Spelman College, is a clinical psychologist widely known for both her expertise on race relations and as a thought leader in higher education. Dr. Tatum is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the prestigious Brock International Prize in Education and the APA Award for Outstanding Lifetime Contributions to Psychology. She is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and was also the Mimi and Peter E. Haas Distinguished Visitor at Stanford University. She holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from Wesleyan University and a master's and PhD degrees in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan. Not to mention another master's degree in religious studies from Hartford Seminary. Dr. Tatum, on behalf of everyone at Wells College, we are so incredibly honored to have you here with us this evening. Before we begin with questions, would you like to say a few words?
Well, yes, I'd like to first of all say thank you for inviting me. I am looking very much forward to this conversation with you and with Serena. And I'm delighted that my book was selected to be the first year read. That is quite an honor. And I am grateful to know that young people at Wells have been thinking and talking about these ideas. So I'm looking forward to our conversation, and hopefully many of them are tuning in to be able to participate in this virtual universe we're in now.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Tatum. So to start us off, Serena, did you have something for Dr. Tatum?
Yes. So my first question is in relation to my reflection that I wrote. A part of the book that really stuck out for me was the colorblind ideology. Growing up, colorblind was something as a positive term, saying that you did not see race when looking or seeing other people for who they were. And reading your book, I've only ever had that one perspective, and reading this part of the book gave me a different perspective. I was just wondering, have you experienced it, or how have you handled the colorblind and having someone with that different opinion?
Sure. Well, let me just say that this idea of being colorblind as a positive is very common. Many people grew up with the idea that, just don't notice, don't comment, don't notice, don't talk about race or racial differences in any way. And the intent, I think, when a parent encourages a child to be colorblind, I think what they're trying to do is encourage that child to be welcoming of everyone, not discriminatory. And there's nothing wrong with helping your kids to be fair-minded and not discriminatory. But when we say that someone is colorblind or I don't see race, what that means to the person who hears it, to that person for whom race is a real important part of their daily experience, it sounds like you're not seeing me, right? If I'm an African American woman moving through the world and my life is being impacted in a variety of ways by issues of race or gender or the combination of racism and sexism, and then for someone to say, oh, I didn't notice you were Black, or oh, I didn't notice you were a woman, I would say, well, how did you even see me? You have overlooked a big part of my life and experience. And so it's that overlooking that most people reject when they say, the goal is not to be colorblind. The goal is to be color fair, maybe, to notice and recognize that people are having different experiences, but not to discriminate on that basis. In my book, I talk about the fact that sometimes when we think a child or a young person is, quote, colorblind because they don't mention somebody's race or ethnicity, they don't talk about it, it may not actually be that they haven't noticed, but that they've learned that they're not supposed to say anything about it. So the phrase I use in the book is many people are not colorblind, they've just learned to be color silent, which is to just not talk about it. But still, their perceptions of other people are being shaped by what they obviously do see. And so getting past that language to perhaps more realistic language about recognizing differences, recognizing different experiences in the world that are being shaped by the social realities of race is an important thing for all of us to see, because if we don't see it, we can't fix it.
I absolutely love that notion of color fairness. Putting it that way for folks to know to even out the interaction rather than go one way or the other with interactions. That notion of color fairness is a great one. Thank you for that. Yeah. A real issue that we see, Dr. Tatum, in our rural areas is that we have overwhelmingly white teaching staffs, right? But an increasingly visually diverse, but still overwhelmingly white student body. So what would you suggest as the best ways to approach conversations around racial inequities without spotlighting the only Black or brown child in the room?
This is a tricky question because I'm sure many young people who are listening, if they've been in this spot, they know what I'm going to say. If you're the only Black or brown kid in the class and the teacher starts talking about an issue that's relevant to your life experience or your ancestors' experience, I'm thinking right now about, let's say, discussions of slavery. If you're the only Black kid in the class when the teacher is talking about the Civil War and slavery, or talking about the Civil Rights Movement, or anything related specifically to the experience, in this case, of African Americans, it's a common experience for the child, that Black child in the classroom, to all of a sudden feel all the eyes of his white or her white classmates on looking at her, right? People are turning their heads to see what's your reaction. And there is that sense of being in the spotlight. A teacher in some ways cannot avoid that entirely. If we're covering, let's say it's February, Black History Month, we're going to be talking about the history, much of which is painful, though certainly not all of it. And, if we're focusing on that, let's say during Black History Month, and that sense of being suddenly under the spotlight is uncomfortable for that one Black kid, the teacher has a role in shifting that focus. Let's imagine, I'm going to go back to my original example. Let's imagine the topic is slavery. It doesn't have to be Black History Month, but let's imagine the topic is slavery and kids are turning to look at that Black kid to see what's his or her response. A teacher could intervene. A teacher could say something like this. Let's imagine the teacher could say, when we talk about these issues, we often wonder what the experience was like for the Black people. Maybe even Black people in the room. That might feel a little awkward because it's only one kid. But let's imagine if the teacher said, but I'd like us to take a moment and think about what was going on in the minds of the white people when that was happening. What were the enslavers thinking about? What were the abolitionists thinking about? And then sort of shifting the focus to, let's not stare at the Black kid in the room. Let's look at ourselves. How are we connected to this history as white people? The teacher can shift that focus in a way that could be helpful. Another way to address it, though, is also important, and that is to have a conversation with the kid or the parent, depending on the age of the child, to say, we're going to be talking about a topic which I know might feel uncomfortable for your son or daughter. Here's what I was thinking about doing in the classroom. I'd like your feedback. Or, I remember when my kids who grew up in a predominantly white community, I have two sons, and when one of my kids was about in the 4th or 5th grade, his teacher was wanting to celebrate the winter holidays. It was around, the season of Christmas and Hanukkah. And she wanted to acknowledge that it's not just Christmas. She was going to do Hanukkah, but she also wanted to talk about Kwanzaa. And he was the only Black child in the class. And she was thinking maybe he would like to talk about Kwanzaa to his classmates. But she did something that I really appreciated as a parent. She didn't just put him on the spot that day. She called me up and said, we're doing this unit on the winter holidays. I'd like to include Kwanzaa. I'm wondering if your family celebrates Kwanzaa. That was the first thing. Now, as it turns out, we did, right? So I could say, yes, we celebrate Christmas, but we also celebrate Kwanzaa. And she said, well, I was wondering about that. Do you think your son would be willing to talk to his classmates about how you all celebrate Kwanzaa in your house? And I said, well, I'll ask him. Now, my son, at that age was kind of shy, but I did ask him. I said, your teacher is going to be talking about holidays, and she wonders if you'd like to talk about Kwanzaa. And, you could bring in some of the things we use for our celebration and talk about that. Is that something you'd like to do? He had a big grin on his face. He thought it would be fabulous to do that. And sure enough, he did. And so what I appreciated, though, was that she gave him a heads up, right? She contacted me. First of all, how embarrassing would it have been if she said, please tell us about Kwanzaa. And he said, Kwanzaa what? I mean, maybe he didn't, if he didn't know, that would have really been embarrassing. And even knowing, he might have felt like unprepared or uncomfortable being singled out, maybe. But in this way, because she approached it in that way, he was able to prepare himself and come to class and be, very happily do some show and tell.
Great, thank you. Serena?
Another big question for me, now that I've seen a different perspective on the colorblind ideology, I want to share that perspective. As you said, it's not really common for that. So I was wondering, how can I share my ideas with people that have differing opinions compared
That
to
is a great question, Serena. And I think this is a perfect example of what I'm going to call the three F's. What do I mean by those three F's? It stands for felt, found, and feel. So, what do I mean? You, talking to some friends or family members, could say, there was a time when I felt that being colorblind was really a good thing. But then I found out this new information. I read this book, I heard this talk, and I now feel that the goal isn't really to be colorblind. Everybody wants to be seen for who they are. But, my goal is to be, maybe you want to use that term, color fair. Or my goal is to be someone who can see somebody's experience and understand that race does make a difference. I don't want to ignore that. Now I realize that when I said I was being colorblind, I was kind of ignoring somebody's experience. I don't want to do that anymore. Now, what you can hear in what I've just said, imagining I was you talking to one of your friends or a family member, is that you started out by saying, I used to agree with you. I used to feel that way. But then I found out this new information and it changed how I feel. I now feel this way. And in explaining it in that way, you never really say to that other person, oh, you're so wrong. You're saying, there was a time when I agreed, but now I know this, and so I feel differently. And the person you're talking to is much less likely to respond defensively when what you are really explaining is your own learning journey. And that when you share your learning journey, it might actually lead the person you're talking to start a learning journey of their own. Maybe they'll say, that sounds kind of interesting. What was that book you read? And maybe they're now reading it with you. But I have found that using that strategy, where you're talking about yourself, not about that other person, not you're wrong, you shouldn't think that. But I felt that way. I found this out. I now feel this way. Can be a great strategy.
I hope you all are jotting that down, the three F's. It's wonderful. Dr. Tatum, in rural upstate New York,
Yeah.
we know that one common train of thought is that racism ended with slavery, right? And as professionals who perform community outreach and anti-racism work all the time, we know this is not true.
Yeah.
So what are some effective ways that we can maybe help those other parts of our community understand and acknowledge that racism is still a big problem that needs to be solved today?
Well, I think, unfortunately, in some ways, it's gotten easier to make this point because there's been so much of it in the news, right? So we all saw the murder of George Floyd on television and on our computer screens and on our handheld devices. That video went viral, and it was pretty hard to deny that race had a role. I'm speaking to you today on the 13th of January, and just a week ago on the 6th of January, we saw a mob of white, mostly white, I think I don't remember seeing any person non-white in that crowd, storming the Capitol. And we saw police restraining themselves considerably in terms of their response to that, what people are calling that insurrection. Most commentators that I have seen talking about this on television and in other news media have made the point that the response was considerably different than it was to the multiracial crowds associated with Black Lives Matter over the summer and at other times. It's hard to say, if you've been paying any attention to the news of late, that race doesn't still matter in our country in terms of how people are treated. So while it is, hard sometimes to get people to acknowledge what seems to be right in their faces, It's pretty hard to ignore some of those visual images that we've been exposed to over the last several months. And of course, we know how difficult the COVID-19 pandemic has been and the disproportionate impact it has had on communities of color as well, linked to different access to healthcare and employment opportunities and, the low wage essential workers that so many of which are in fact people of color having a very different COVID experience than those who've been able to work from home and in the relative safety and comfort of their own homes.
Dr. Tatum, have you found particular strategies to be more helpful than others when it comes to trying to have folks acknowledge these happenings?
Well, I think, again, a picture's worth 1,000 words. The videos, short video segments, personal narratives. It's nice if you can get somebody to read a 300-page book, but sometimes you can't, right? And so, but there are so many. I'm going to give an example without getting too specific. I serve on a board, and we were talking about racial inequity as a group. And as part of our discussion, we were given a video, a short video, 5-minute video to watch where some students talked about experiences they'd had on their campus. And it was quite compelling to hear these students in their own words describe incidents where they felt that fellow students had treated them differently because of their racial or ethnic background. Sometimes those individual narratives can be quite powerful. Person to person, listening to somebody's experience, that can be very powerful. Seeing that, to come back to the George Floyd example, that George Floyd video, it's very hard to argue with such compelling images without getting very distressed by them. So it is, so I think sometimes helping people connect person to person to another person's experience can be one way to do that. I do want to say, that there are some people who have grown up deeply steeped in stereotypical information. Maybe they haven't had, because maybe they haven't lived around people of color, they haven't had much direct contact, but maybe they've heard a lot of mythology. Maybe they've heard a lot of stereotypes. Maybe they've internalized the prejudices that family members have or that other folks in their community have, and they don't have any experiences to counteract it. And sometimes you might find that people are really wanting to hold on to those beliefs because they want that sense of superiority that comes from really internalizing ideas of white supremacy. But most people, in my experience, most people are open to new information if you give them a chance to hear it and digest it. I have taught about racism for a long time, most of it in classrooms. And I've found that students of all backgrounds are really hungry for new information. Much like Serena talked about, she had some ideas, but she came across some new information and it really made sense to her. And she wants now to talk to other people about it. That's been my experience, that most people, that if you give them information that they can understand, is presented in a way that they can understand, they want to take it in. And once you get it in your head, then you want to share it with others. And that is a process that we can all participate in. Can I say one more thing about that?
You can say a million more things.
There are folks in the world who just don't want to hear it, right? Just don't want to hear it. And I'm looking at our screen, we've got 85 participants participating in this conversation, listening. And some of them might be saying to themselves, I really wish person X was tuning in. That person really needed to hear this. She's just preaching to the choir. And I like to say the choir needs rehearsal. And what I mean by that is that even if you think, that some person who really just doesn't get it needs to be part of the conversation, those people who are willingly participating need to be helped to deepen their understanding and get better at their own ability to sing. What I loved about Serena's first question was, I have learned something, but I want to be able to talk about it to some other people. How can I do that? It's like she's saying, I'm in the choir, but I want to sing better, and the better she sings, the better all of us sing, the more we inspire others to sing with us, right? If you hear a really great choir, they sound good, they look like they're having fun, you want to be part of it. And so the better, those of us who have learned the tune, the more of us, the better we sing, the more likely there will be people joining in with us.
Do you mind if I use that choir analogy?
Oh, please, please.
Thank you. Serina?
So another question I have is, when you were writing the book was really powerful for me to read. And writing it, did you have a certain hope for what the book would do for the people reading it, or what you wanted specifically the reader to take away from the book?
Absolutely. So let me start by saying this. I have a long history with this book. And what I mean by that is I wrote the first version of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria in 1996. And it was published in the fall of 1997. So now we're talking about, 24 years ago when it came out in print. And when I first wrote it, I was a professor of psychology in Massachusetts at Mount Holyoke College. And I had been teaching a course on the psychology of racism for by that time, about 15, 16 years. And I realized from my experience teaching that there were a lot of people who just didn't really understand what racism was. That they can, prejudice and racism, those are terms that people were using pretty much interchangeably. They don't mean exactly the same thing. There were ideas that I had been using in my class that I thought the wider population, that, you shouldn't have to take a class with Beverly Tatum to have the opportunity to think about what is racism in our society? How does it really operate? Not just in terms of individual attitudes or prejudices that somebody might have, but the systems of, whether that's in education or economics or in healthcare or in employment more generally or housing, all of these things that we all participate in, all of these systems that we participate in are shaped by racism in our society. And I wanted people to understand that. But I also, from my point of view as a psychologist, wanted my readers to think about how their own sense of self, their own sense of identity was shaped by the racial context in which we all live in this society. And then I wanted the readers to think about, okay, I understand that racism is a problem, that it impacts all of us and shapes how we think about ourselves and other people. But now what can we do about it? So another way of saying this is, I wanted the book to have 3 parts: what, so what, and now what, right? What is racism? So what difference does it make in terms of how we think about ourselves and other people? Now what can we do about it? And that's what I was thinking about in 1996, 97 when the book came out. Fast forward 20 years, it's 2016, 2017, and I'm working on the version of the book you read, the 20th anniversary edition, and I wanted to update it. I still wanted it to have those 3 parts: what, so what, now what. But I also wanted to answer some of the questions that readers have asked me over the years. So, when people read the original version of my book, sometimes they'd send me emails and they'd say, well, I read your book, but what about this? Or I read your book and I had that response. And the faculty members who have been using the earlier version of my book in their classes, I had the opportunity to ask some of those faculty members to say, are there ideas in the book that you think need further amplification? Or are there questions that your students have that maybe I didn't address? And so because I had that feedback from the earlier version, and because we are, 20 years later, there were some things that had changed, I wanted to really update the new version of the book in a way that answered some of the questions that had been asked of me. If you compare the two books, one of the things you'll notice is that the new version of the book is about more than 100 pages longer. It's, thicker. There are a lot more footnotes or, notes in the back of the book. And in part, that was because when people read it the first time, some of the people wrote to me and said, I'm not sure I agree with you on this point. Or, I'm wondering about this, you made this statement, but where's the evidence? And so I made a more concerted effort in the new version of the book to really document with more detail some of the patterns of racism in our society than I did in the first version, because I really wanted people to say, oh yeah, I get it. I see what you're talking about, because look at all the evidence.
Our friends from the Nazareth College's social work program understand that from a systems perspective, your work reminds them as social workers that discussions centered on race are essential from young age and throughout the lifespan. As professionals, we understand that that's important, but it can be very difficult to know how to frame the discussions or even where to begin. How can we facilitate conversations about racism and support colleagues, whether they are social workers, teachers, college administrators, to really lead these discussions throughout the lifespan?
Sure. Well, there are two ways of responding to your question, and I have sort of two thoughts in my head about it. The first one has to do with peer-to-peer conversations, right? So if I'm a social worker working in an office with other social workers, what conversations are we having with each other? Or, a college administrator to another college administrator, or, faculty member in a department to one of his or her departmental colleagues. Those peer-to-peer conversations can also be awkward, but they can also be a source of shared learning, right? So a department, whether it's in a school of social work or, the biology department, doesn't matter, or, a unit, an employee, a work group, maybe that's a better way of describing it. A work group of peers could say to each other, there's been a lot going on in the world that we don't quite understand. Maybe we should spend some time talking about what the implication of what's happening in the world right now is for us and the work we do. We could have a book club in our work group where we're all reading something together. Maybe it's a book, maybe it's a set of articles, maybe we're going to watch a video together, but where we are going to spend some time with each other, deepening our knowledge and practicing the skill of really engaging in tough conversations about race. That's one strategy, right? Where we're all gonna go on this learning journey together and listen carefully, because we're not all the same, right? We might have a diverse office and not everybody's experiencing racism in the same way. But if we make an agreement that we're going to listen to each other respectfully and spend some time over a few weeks or maybe the course of a semester, really talking and listening to each other, it's certainly possible that we are really going to have a deeper understanding of these questions, of these feelings, this reality. We're going to have a deeper understanding and get better at having the conversation. And if we've practiced with ourselves, then we're going to be better able to do it with students or with people outside of our work group, because, you know, we're developing a skill that, you know, it's like the choir rehearsing, right? So there's that. But I was also thinking about the social worker who's working with a client and wants to talk to the client about race or racism, you know, wanting to talk to the client about their experience. Maybe it's a white social worker with a client of color, for example, a Black client. Let's just imagine that. And maybe the white social worker wants to ask the Black client about that client's experience of racism, but doesn't quite know how to ask the question. There are, you know, I read an example of this, which I thought was a great way to do it, which is to say something like, I know that many people in your position, I'm making this up, but, you know, let's imagine I'm talking to a client and I maybe my client is the only Black person in the office where that person works. And let's imagine the social worker or the therapist, I'm going to use, you know, sort of the therapist context. I'm a psychologist, could be a social worker, could be a psychologist, could be a psychotherapist of some other background, counseling psychologist. Let's imagine the therapist wants to ask the client about their experience of racism in the workplace. The client hasn't brought it up, and maybe the client's not sure they can bring it up with this white therapist. But maybe the therapist wants to let the client know, I'm willing to hear what you have to say on this subject. I'm not so fragile that you can't talk about racism with me, right? And so how could you signal that? You could say something like, I know that many people in the circumstance that you're in, the only Black person in an office, sometimes experience microaggressions or other kinds of difficult situations which are race related. I know that's true for many people. It might not be true for you, but I'm wondering whether that has ever been a concern for you. And so then you just wait and see if the person wants to say something. They might say no, you know, you could say, well, that's okay. You know, I asked because I know that it's common. I didn't know if it was true for you, but I thought I should check in with you about it. And then you go on if the person doesn't want to talk about it. But you've signaled to the person that, you know, it could be an issue, and it's up to them to share or not share as they choose. But I really like that sort of phrasing. I know that many people have experienced situations like this. You know, I'm not saying that you have, I'm not saying that you should have, I'm just saying many people have, and I'm wondering whether this is something that's a concern for you.
Would your suggestion change on the facilitating of these conversations if the workplace was exclusively or predominantly white? And I'm speaking peer-to-peer, so not therapist to client, but just within the confines of the workplace.
And so if the question is like, if you like to you, I can speak from experience, right? So I'm a Black woman and I have been working in many higher ed settings. I served as president of Spelman College, which is a historically Black college for women. But the other colleges prior to that, all my jobs prior to my Spelman job were at predominantly white institutions. And all of the schools I attended were predominantly white institutions. And so so let's imagine, I'll give you a very specific real life example. When I was a faculty member, young, untenured faculty member, junior, as they say, a junior faculty member in the department, I was the only Black faculty member, not just in the department, but in the building, right? You know, there were very few. I was the only Black woman on the whole campus, right? As a faculty member, I was the only Black woman faculty member. And so I'm in an all-white department except for me. And I had a Black student who was one of my advisees. Now, the school was predominantly white. Most of the students I advised were white, but I had a Black student who was also one of my advisees. And she came to me and was concerned. Well, she came to me because it was advising time. You know, it was time to sit down, look at her transcript, talk about what she was going to take the next semester, as you do with all your advisees. And this particular student had a very checkered academic record, an A in one subject, a D in another. You know, I mean, she was clearly capable of doing A work, but in some classes she was excelling, in other classes she was like she wasn't even showing up. And so I asked her, what's going on with you? You know, I'm looking at your transcript. You did very well in this class. You know, you barely passed this one. What's going on? And she began to tell me about one of those classes where she had not done well, that she'd been in the course at the beginning of the semester, first exam. She did very well on the first exam, got an A. And when the faculty member was passing out the exams, the white male faculty member handed her her exam and said, "Congratulations, you did very well." And then he said, "Black students don't usually do well in my class." And she felt offended by his remark. Now, you might say, well, you know, toughen up, ignore it. But she was so put off by his comment that she found it hard to be in his presence in the classroom. And so what she did was stop going to class. Okay, so if you don't go to class, you're not going to do very well. You know, you're going to miss the notes, you're going to miss some assignments, you're not going to do well. And in fact, her grades after that conversation, that brief conversation with the faculty member, plummeted. Okay, so now I'm the junior faculty member. And what am I supposed to do with this information? She tells me I know the professor who said the thing. Should I go tell him about his comment and the negative impact it had on her? Well, it turned out that person wasn't just another faculty member. That person was the chair of my department. And so, you know, he's one of the people who's going to decide whether I get promoted or not. And, you know, do I want to make him mad at me or create an awkward situation? So I had to really think about how was I going to do that? So fast forward, not immediately, but a little while later, I found myself sitting in that person's office. We were talking about something unrelated to this. And then we started talking about a comment that a fellow colleague had made and my concern that it reflected some racial bias relative to a particular situation we were talking about. And my colleague said to me, the department chair said to me, you know, I think you're wrong. I hired everyone in the department. There's not a prejudice bone in anyone's body. And I said, you know, I get that everyone in the department is good-hearted. We're all good-hearted people. I said, but we all have prejudices. We breathe in smog, right? Prejudice is like, these attitudes are like smog in the air. We all breathe them in. And if we are breathing things in, we're gonna sometimes breathe them out. For example, I said, I had a student come to see me about something one of her professors said. I didn't say it was him. And I said, you know, she did very well in the first exam, and then the professor handed her back this exam and said what he said. I repeated it back. And I said, and that was really offensive to her. And it was so offensive, she stopped going to class. It really undermined her feeling about being successful in that professor's class. Now, though I didn't say, and it was you who said it, I could see that when I was describing what had happened, there was that little glint of recognition, you know, in his face. And he didn't say I did it, and I didn't say you did it, but I said it was hurtful. And and I'm quite sure that when professors say things like that, they don't mean to be hurtful. They didn't mean to alienate students, but it was alienating. And then he said to me, well, I can see how that might be, as he thought about it. He said, I could see how that might be. Now, I don't know whether that solved the problem. Did he never do it again? I can't say. I wasn't in his classroom every day. But it's sort of an example of how even when you're in a subordinate position, as I was at that time as an untenured junior faculty member, you can coach up, so to speak. You can give feedback in a way that helps your colleagues think about some issues that maybe they might not have otherwise thought about. But it is hard sometimes, and it helps if there are others, even if they're not in your department, other people who you can connect with and get support from. In this day of Zoom technology, being able to Zoom with a faculty member, maybe from another institution who's experiencing something similar, to provide some support. Moral support is important.
Thank you for that. Serena? You're muted,
Serena.
I kind of want to know what you were talking about, how you had the book, the what, so what, and now what. Out of those three parts, what would you say is your favorite part or the most impactful part, you believe?
That's hard to say because they kind of all go together, I feel like the what is really important. It's really important for people to understand the nature of the problem. And I think that so many people think of racism as individual attitudes or behaviors. Like if someone is spouting hateful racial slurs, we would all agree that's racist behavior. But the person who doesn't do those things, but still supports discriminatory policies, knowingly or unknowingly, is also participating in racism. So the analogy I use in my book at the very beginning, where I talk about racism as being like a moving walkway, like maybe you remember this analogy, but if we think of those moving walkways they have at the airport, like a little, you step onto it, you get carried along. If we think about the policies and practices that have been rooted in our society for a long time, policies around housing, policies around employment, policies around access to education, policies that influence healthcare, all of these policies and practices might have been instituted a long time ago, but they still have effects today. And it's like stepping, and I'm not responsible for those policies. I didn't create them. You didn't create them. No one on this call today created them, but they've been operating. We've all participated in them because they were operating when we showed up. So it's kind of like stepping onto that moving walkway at the airport. It was moving before you got there, but you step onto it and you are being carried along by it. Now, let's imagine that moving walkway was what I'm going to call the walkway of racism. There are some people who are on that moving walkway who like where it's headed. We might call them white supremacists. And those people are walking fast. It's like they're walking fast on that moving walkway because they want to go where it's headed. There are other people who would never agree with that white supremacist ideology if it were explained to them. They would say, no, I don't believe that. But they're still standing on that walkway and they're being carried along. And so as they're being carried along, if you're at the airport, you might have seen people who just stand still. They don't walk, they just stand still, but they're still being carried along by the walkway. They end up in the same place as the people who are walking fast. But let's imagine you were standing on that walkway and you said, I don't want to go where racism is taking me. I don't want to go where this moving walkway is taking me. I'm going to turn around. I'm just going to face in a different direction. Well, unless you do something, you're still being carried along, but now you're just traveling backwards, right? You don't see where you're going, but you're still being carried along. The only way to interrupt this walkway of racism or this cycle of racism, the only way to interrupt it is to actively walk in the opposite direction, to be actively working to interrupt the process. And that's what we call anti-racist behavior. When you are doing things that are actively intended to interrupt those entrenched patterns of racism in our society. Many people think they're being anti-racist because they stopped walking. But in fact, they're just being carried along passively. It's only if you're actively working against those policies and practices, trying to create something new and more equitable, that you can really say this, you're being anti-racist. So I guess that part is the most important, to answer your question. It's because I feel like that's a fundamental idea that people need to understand. So, it's why it's at the beginning. But at the end, there are ideas about what we can do about it. And ultimately, that's what we want people to end up. We want people to end up feeling like, I have a sphere of influence. We all do. I can use my time, my talent, my energy to interrupt this process to make a better society for all of us.
Sure. Dr. Tatum, what do you feel are those first, second, and third steps towards leading an anti-racist life?
Well, I think the first step is to educate yourself, right? To become aware that there's a problem. Awareness through education is important. But once you become aware, then you have to change behavior. And that takes practice, and you might not always be consistent at it, right? But once you recognize that you want to do things differently and you start trying to do things differently and talk to other people and get them to join you, you become more practiced, more skilled. You deepen your understanding. It's not like, you're one and done, right? You have an insight and you're finished. But we all need to be, I think, continually educating ourselves. When you asked the question, the first thing I thought about was becoming a vegetarian. And as an analogy, right? I am a vegetarian. I have been a vegetarian since 1978. So this is a long time, right? 43 years. But when I first became a vegetarian, I read a lot about it, right? I was learning about it. And then I made the decision, okay, I want to be vegetarian. And what does that mean? Well, I'm going to have to change how I eat. And so did I go from, one day being a meat eater and then another day being a vegetarian? It wasn't that, first I stopped eating this kind of meat. Then I stopped eating that kind of meat. Then I stopped eating that kind of meat. Then I stopped eating fish. Then and I got more practiced at it. Now, I don't think twice about being a vegetarian because I've been at it 43 years and I know quite a lot about how to make a vegetarian meal and, gone about my business. In some ways, it's analogous to learning how to work against racism. You have to understand what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And then, maybe it means you're going to change this part of your life and then you're going to give up this other part and then you're going to do this differently. And I use the phrase give up. I want to say when you make a change, it might feel like giving up, but you're always gaining something too, right? In my case, maybe I'm gaining better health. Maybe I'm gaining new friends who also share this value. Maybe I am learning new skills. So it might feel like, if I tell my friends that I don't want them to use that language around me, or if I tell my friends that I really don't like those jokes, or if I express a point of view that others don't agree with, maybe I will lose that relationship. Sometimes people worry about that. And it might be that some friendship patterns will change, but you're also going to gain some new ones that you never imagined, that you never anticipated. And your life can become richer in a way that you might not have even expected. So it's a journey. I like to use that word. It's a journey, but I feel like it's a journey we all need to be on if we want to get to a society where we all feel like we can have peace and justice.
That's an excellent segue, because I've been thinking a lot that, as colleges and universities, the core of our work should really be geared towards the creation of these brave spaces in which all community members, feel as though they belong, and they're empowered to thrive socially and also academically. But too often, this isn't the case. Many community members, whether faculty, staff, or students, they feel as though diversity and inclusivity is none of their concern. So in the past, I've heard folks say things like, I'm not racist, so I'm not going to go to this diversity program, or I'm not, Black or a woman or a member of the LGBTQ plus community, insert marginalized group here, right? So this also isn't for me. So it tends to create a lot of spaces on campus where we encounter echo chambers with like-minded folks always at the table. And those folks at the table may not hold positional power to affect positive change. So I think this has a lot to do with the choir analogy you gave to me, but how can we get folks to the table that feel like the work is not for them?
Well, I think that I'm going to come back to my choir analogy, right? So we want to acknowledge that the people who are at the table, the people who are there, need support and need to, the choir needs rehearsal. But let's say there's some people who haven't expressed an interest in singing, right? They don't have an interest. How do we engage them? Well, sometimes I think it is through information, right? So let's say I'm chair of a department and I think this work isn't about me. I'm a math professor. I teach math. What does math have to do with diversity? Well, let's look at who's in your math classes. Let's look at, who's choosing to major in math. I heard Serena, I think she said she was a math major. Am I right? So let's look at who's choosing to major in math and who is having success and who isn't. Let's disaggregate our data. Let's better understand. Now, in my experience, most faculty members want to feel as though they're making a difference in their students' lives. That's why they become professors. And so if somebody can show me data that says, over a period of time, have you noticed that there are very few students of color who are coming to your course, or who are coming to your course and are being successful, or who are choosing to major in your area? Is it your intention to exclude a particular group of students from being successful in your department? Most people would say, no, that's not my intention. Well, let's look at the data and let's think about what could we do differently to empower the students for success. What would it take? And how can we think about this in a way that doesn't stigmatize students, but empowers them to be successful? There are some great resources that help faculty members think about these questions. Sometimes people don't want to think about them because they feel like there's nothing they can do about it. But, it's like, I don't want to feel powerless, so maybe I just will ignore it. But there are great resources that people are writing about today that can, if they can do it at that institution, how come we can't do it at our institution? I'm going to use Georgia State University as an example. I live in the city of Atlanta. Georgia State is a large public university in Atlanta that has become quite well known over the last few years because with some changes in policies and practices, they have greatly increased the success rates of students of color. It's a predominantly white institution still, but they have greatly improved the success rates, particularly the graduation rates of Black students. There's now no gap between graduation rates of white students and graduation of Black students at Georgia State. And there's a wonderful book that's been written about some of the work that they have done. But I use it as an example to say, well, if they can do it there, how come we can't do it here? You know, what policies and practices might we need to think about? And I find that if you can frame a problem in terms of, surely you want to be more successful, what would it take to help you be more successful? You know, people can line up for that. There's a great book that I have on my desk. I'm going to hold it up here in a minute.
Sure.
I don't know if you can see it. It says, From Equity Talk to Equity Walk. There are a lot of great strategies in this book, and I think it would be a great resource for some of the administrators in particular who are wondering, how do I engage my colleagues in this conversation?
It's funny you bring that book up, Dr. Tatum. A collective of colleges in the area, where actually administrators are actually reading that right now and having weekly discussions on the book.
Oh,
so that's
cool.
Yeah. So I'm happy you shared that. That makes me feel better. We're on the right path.
Yes, you're on the right track.
That's great. That's great. So we actually do have a little bit of time, Dr. Tatum, for questions from our audience members, and we've had some submitted. All right. So
Okay.
if you wouldn't mind.
I don't mind. And in fact, can I just say, while we were talking, I saw one pop up in the chat. So I want to speak to the one I saw, but you're welcome to ask me another one. But I saw that somebody posted chat about resources, K through 12 resources.
Yes.
And I want to give a couple of places where you can get good information and resources. One is Facing History. There's an organization called Facing History. Their website is facinghistory.org. And at Facing History, there are curricula available for teachers, I would say mostly targeted for middle school and high school, about how to talk about these issues in social studies and history and other classes like that, literature, English. But another great resource for teachers at all levels, K through 12, particularly looking for maybe resources for kids, books to read, books to talk about in class, is called Teaching for Change. There's an organization called Teaching for Change, and they have a website called socialjusticebooks.org. And if you go to the socialjusticebooks.org website, you can find books related to most social justice issues, organized by age, lists already curated. There are lots of great resources available at those two sites. So I'll just lift those up as a couple of examples.
Great. Thank you for that, Dr. Tatum. Yeah. A question that we had, we had one community member ask if you could talk more about violations or supports for human dignity.
So I'm not quite sure what the question means. So, if you are, we see human dignity being attacked, regularly. We think of George Floyd's human dignity being attacked and snuffed out as he was killed by that police officer kneeling on his neck. We can think about, I live in Georgia. I can think about the heartbreaking situation of Ahmaud Arbery, a young African-American man in his 20s out for a Sunday jog, being chased by white vigilantes who thought that they had the right to stop him and shoot him. All he was doing was out for a Sunday jog. And so, there clearly that's about a disregard for human dignity. Supports for human dignity. How do we support people's human dignity? I think by treating them with respect, by acknowledging that there is no hierarchy of human value, or shouldn't be one, that we should all be able to move freely through the world without being subjugated to racial stereotypes and discriminatory behavior and et cetera. So I'm not sure I'm answering directly the question, but I'm not quite sure I completely understand what the asker is looking for. Do you have a better sense of the question?
That was the question that was presented, so thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Serena, would you like to ask a question?
I was actually reading a question in the chat, and it really stuck out to me. As a community resident in the village around Wells, this person is, I believe, they would love to hear you talk about how white residents can be supportive of students of color.
Sure. Well, I think that's a great question. And in some ways, if we were all there together in person on the campus of Wells College, I would actually ask students of color to answer that question, because they will know what the experience of being in the village of Wells is like. What you sometimes hear when students of color are attending a school that's in a largely white community, they sometimes talk about their experiences interfacing with the local town where they are viewed suspiciously, maybe followed around in stores, suspicious of, suspected of being potential shoplifters, or sometimes just the difficulty of finding products that they might need or want, whether there's products needed for hair care, for example, or, cosmetics that work for your skin tone, or maybe food items that are particular to your culture or, growing up experience that maybe you're harder to find in the small village that you live in. So one way to be supportive is to, if you're a store owner, to order those products, make them available. If you are a resident, to greet people warmly when they walk in, but not view them suspiciously. To come, I don't know, maybe this happens already, but I'm imagining there are cultural programs that take place at Wells and that are open to not just student members, but the broader community. If that's true, then the broader community can be supportive by attending. One of the, I visit a lot of campuses over the years, and, until COVID, I was visiting a lot of campuses regularly. And one of the things that you sometimes hear from students of color that they say is how frustrating it is when they work on educational programming and then nobody shows up. This kind of goes back to your comment, Andre, where you were saying that, some people feel like, well, I'm not Black, I'm not LGBTQ plus, this is not for me. But allies can be allies simply by showing up, right? To lending support by your physical presence. So I think that if there are members of the Wells community who want to reach out to students of color on campus, one way to do that is to be present in the places where they have been invited to come, public programs that the students organize, and are hoping that people will come and attend because they are essentially opening themselves to say, we want to educate you about who we are and what's important to us. Please come. When you've got nobody in your audience, you're feeling like, well, they don't care about what's important to me. Showing up at that battle.
Without a doubt, and that speaks directly to what my undergrad experience was as well, Dr. Tatum. So thank you for imparting that piece there. And we do have many cultural programs happening. So for folks who are on this within this Zoom call right now, and our community members and are interested in a non-COVID year, I would love to invite you into all of the cultural programming that we have going on. You are more than invited. So you'll hear from me. We have time for one more question here, Dr. Tatum, before we wrap up. And so to preface, we've heard so much in the past week about the need for healing and unity and moving forward. One thing I was struck by was how the rioters at the Capitol, for the most part, do not necessarily characterize themselves as, white supremacists or speak overtly about race or whiteness at times. Yet clearly, this is a motivating factor for some of them. Mm-hmm. How do you think we can go about with a healing process for our nation without losing ground on that anti-racist work?
Well, I don't think we can have a healing. So I've been thinking about this. I've been hearing people talk about we need to heal, we need to heal. You can't heal a wound until it's been cleaned. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we have to do that. People want to say, well, let's just move on and, try to, I've been listening to the news a lot today. I want to just position ourselves in the moment of history where the House of Representatives has this afternoon voted to impeach the president for a second time in what was a bipartisan vote, mostly Democrats, but some Republicans also voting. And, and I listened to the speeches of representatives who were not in favor of impeachment and those who were, but some who were not in favor of impeachment talked about the need to, that this is going to be a divisive action and we need to heal. But like I said, you can't heal a wound. I mean, anybody knows that if you have a wound and you don't clean it first, put a Band-Aid on it, it's just going to fester underneath that Band-Aid. The infection's going to grow. We have to spend some time cleaning our wounds before we expect them to heal. And looking through the lens of anti-racism is, I think, part of the cleaning process. So we can't lose that focus.
And I'm going to sneak one more question in, Dr. Tatum, because I got you here.
I'm going to leave.
No, please don't. So, from the centuries and centuries of trauma, right? And just from this past summer and the happenings and the new ignition of the fight for Black lives.
Yes.
How can we begin to have students, BIPOC students, come back to institutions and feel comfortable again? Being at PWIs and feeling comfortable connecting, with their administrators, with their faculty, with their peers.
Yeah. Well, I think this is where this is where it's important for the white community to be able to talk about issues of race and racism. And what I mean by that is, if something bad has happened and I come into a community, like I show up at work and everybody is just sort of tiptoeing around the situation. Nobody wants to mention it because they don't know how, or they're afraid they might make it worse, or, and so they retreat into silence. Then I am left feeling like, what's wrong? I can't just pretend it didn't happen. I want to talk to somebody about it. If nobody will engage with me, then I'm, as I said, I was participating in a meeting where a similar kind of question was being talked about, and a student said, it's not just microaggressions, it's microaggressions with gaslighting, meaning, you're experiencing stuff and people are trying to make you feel like it's not happening, that it's just your imagination. And yet, it's not, and you want to be able to talk about it. So one way for people to feel comfortable is for allies to step up and say, I am here to listen. I'm here to help problem solve. I'm here to think through what we can do next. I'm willing to have these conversations, sometimes even when you're not in the room. White people talking to other white people about how they can get better at being anti-racist is work that can happen without the people of color having to always be part of the heavy lifting. So, so I think that that's really important. But I also think it's important to recognize the importance of self-care. We've heard some conversations about self-care over the last year and maybe longer than that. And I think it's really important to recognize for any student who's doing this work, to recognize that there are times when you have to step away from it for a little while. You know, that a friend of mine told me something a long time ago, and maybe this is a good note to end on. He said, you do, you know, the anti-racism work that you do is can be very draining. And he certainly was right about that. And he said, anytime you're doing work like that, you're making psychological withdrawals. You know, you're withdrawing, it's taking up energy. If you make a lot of withdrawals, you better make a lot of deposits. And that's what I would say to students. You know, what's your withdrawal deposit ratio, right? You know, we know in your bank account, if you're taking a lot of money out, you better be putting some money in. And so in that same way, you know, what's going to restore your spirit? You know, maybe it's going to be time alone. Maybe it's going to be time spent with friends. Maybe it's going to be time listening to music. Maybe it's going to be time, you know, doing some exercise or reading a good book or vegging out on some Netflix, whatever it might be. You have to think about self-care so that you don't get so depleted that you're just on the edge of burnout.
That was a great one. Check your withdrawn deposit ratio, everyone.
Yeah.
Another gem. This was absolutely amazing, Dr. Tatum. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. And thank you everyone for being able to come out and spend some time with us. Just wanted to remind you all that this posting will be on YouTube channel in the next few days or so, and people could easily find it just by searching Wells College. I want to again thank Chris Pollock, Michelle Landers, and of course, Serina Sheridan, class of 2024. And Dr. Tatum, is there anything that you'd like to leave folks with, or?
I just want to say thank you again. You know, anytime you write a book, you want people to read it. So I thank you all for reading it and for inviting me to have this conversation. And to you and Serena, thank you for being such great conversation partners.
You as well, Dr. Tatum. It's been so lovely. I wish you all the best. And again, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.